Hello, all. Welcome to the Harbor YouTube channel where we talk about our Thursday night gatherings. I'm Dottie, one of the co-pastors. This is Jon, one of the co-pastors. And we started a new series or a new conversation at Harbor where we will be looking at the book of Acts. And Jon kicked us off last night. So Jon, you started the conversation. What are we doing when we're studying the book of Acts, and what is the lens that you are bringing to it?
Yeah, thanks, Dottie. Technically, I did kick us off, but it might be more accurate to say that Willie James Jennings kicked us off last night. He is a theologian who has written a really, really wonderful commentary on the book of Acts, which we used a lot last night, and I think we'll continue to use throughout this series of discussions. I recommend anyone who's interested in Acts or in these topics we're discussing to check out this book. You can order it online, and I think you can get it on Amazon for like 25 bucks. So it's not the cheapest book, but um, we looked at an overall approach we are going to take theologically to the book of Acts, borrowed from Willie Jennings. And then we looked at our first story from Acts that we're going to be looking at in this series, which was the miracle of Pentecost in the second chapter. Um, I'll give a brief overview of kind of our approach because I think anyone checking out this video may be able to make it or not for some of these weeks, but it'll be good to know the kind of overall way we're going to be reading this book together. And so Jennings is a theologian, but the genre of Acts is history. It's written as a historical narrative. So, what do we do to theologically read an act that purports to be historical? And Jennings says, well, we're supposed to grapple with history, not sit around and just debate it and academically dissect it, but like we're supposed to grapple with it. And he says we grapple with it by entering the history of Acts, by telling its history, and by learning it deeply. And so for each one of these forms of grappling, he introduces like a key theological aspect of his entire approach to the book. And so entering history for Jennings is recognizing in the text and in our own context this tension between empire and diaspora, and that faith is playing out always in places where this tension exists. So you see that in Acts, we see it in our own lives, and that's what it means to enter the history of Acts. Secondly, we tell the history, and the history we're telling both in Acts and when we tell our own spiritual history is, according to Jennings, it's the history of the Spirit joining people and peoples together. People who used to be separated from each other, whether racially, politically, nationally, like whatever divides us, even divided by hostility and hatred. The idea that God joins people, breaking down those barriers so that they belong to each other, so that they can live in intimacy and mutual belonging with one another, and also uniting us to God. And so that's kind of the history we tell. And then thirdly, what we're supposed to be learning at a deep, deep level, according to Jennings, is that the Spirit isn't just doing this randomly. It's not just like, oh, well, I'm going to join some people, but that God fiercely, passionately desires us, desires people, desires that people be in intimacy and love, both with each other and with God. And so God's desire is kind of the part of the history we're supposed to learn. And so we looked at Acts 2 and sort of the miracle of the people speaking in different languages at the Pentecost event. And we looked at some of these themes. We, as time allowed, our discussion groups talked about, do we see empire and diaspora in this story and in our own lives? Do we see the Spirit joining people and peoples who used to be separated? Do we see little traces of God's desire, of what God really passionately wants when we read this text and when we reflect on our own experiences and journeys? So that was kind of the overall approach we took last night, and that we'll continue to take throughout these discussions.
Thanks so much, Jon. It was really helpful for you to kick us off that way and frame the book of Acts. And one of the ways we're inviting our community to look at the book of Acts is as God's invitation to love and belong in the midst of empire. And so that is both historical and also something that we are participating in today. So fascinating. And for many of us, we haven't maybe thought of Acts this way before. So it is new and really interesting. Yeah, what were some of the themes or conversations that came up in your discussion group?
Yeah, there were several interesting ones, but I will skip straight to the juicy part, just right to the provocative topic. You know, when Jennings writes about God's desire, intense desire, one of the ways he tries to, I think, get us to really wrestle with this idea is that he uses the word erotic. He says God erotically desires, the Spirit erotically desires us. And there was a mixed reaction in our discussion group about Jennings's use of that word. And I think it's fair to question, is he just being kind of sensationalistic, right? Is this just being provocative just for the sake of being provocative? I mean, maybe that's a way someone could read it. For me, though, it's really useful to at least reckon with this idea, because for me, what it points to is another angle to kind of push back against this mind-body dualism that we have inherited since the Enlightenment. There's a way of thinking about God desiring us where we could just think of it as over spiritualized, right? We're these flesh and blood people living these very concrete lives. And yet there's a spirit God invisible somewhere who only desires that this invisible spirit part of me would have a salvation experience or whatever. And that it's all just on a spiritual axis. It's all very mysterious and invisible and mystical, and it doesn't actually necessarily touch and affect my everyday life, which is lived with skin and flesh and bones. But by saying that God erotically desires us, to me, it pushes it more in the embodied and fleshed direction. And it's like God desires me, this whole me, which is also a body, in addition to being a brain and a soul. And so I like it. I think it is provocative. I think it's provocative in a helpful way for me. But that was a big discussion point in our room. I'm curious what came up for you in your discussion.
Yeah, that's interesting. We didn't necessarily untangle the word erotic, but we did spend time talking about what that might mean for mutual belonging. And someone in our group shared a beautiful story of how important touch was for belonging and offering care to someone at the end of their life who wasn't able to communicate really in any way. But every night when they would take care of them and get them ready for bed, they would kiss them on the cheek. And eventually that person kissed them back, which was kind of this miraculous miracle story of someone not being able to communicate, responding to being touched. So our group really finished with how significant it is to belong in the physical and to be loved by people and to physically be held and like hugged or kissed or whatever. Someone shared about being a mama bear and going to pride parades and just offering free hugs and how important that is for people to feel that. And so we finished our gathering last night with a practice of just giving ourselves a hug and feeling the embrace of our community, that we belong in our community. And one of the hard parts of our community is we're not able to physically touch one another, right? After service or when if someone's crying or going through something hard, normally we would be able to hold one another in a really profound way. And the only time we've been able to do that is at the Harbor Retreat. And so it's interesting trying to sort out like how important touch is in our own sense of belonging. And also we don't see each other in person often, at most once a year. And so it was really good to think about how do we kind of foster the sensation of belonging and touch in this virtual space.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I really loved the little exercise that where you had us give ourselves a hug. And I like too that you encouraged us if we wanted to look up at the screen and see each other's faces, as if to say, this is not just me hugging myself.
Yeah.
This is we're all actually hugging each other to the best of our ability on a Zoom screen.
Yeah.
I thought was really cool. And for the naysayers still, for this use of the word erotic, I'll just say that I think Jennings would say, for what it's worth, that activity we did and the story of the mama bear hugs and the story of caring for someone who's dying, these are stories of erotic desire, not sexual desire, but physical, embodied, I want to touch you, I want you to touch me desire, which I think he would call erotic. So, anyway, just to give a little more context for that. But it sounds like really wonderful stories in your group.
Yeah, that's great context, John. Well, thanks for leading us through a great night last night, and I'm looking forward to diving into the Book of Acts. This is gonna be really fun.
Me too. Thanks, Dottie.